In the work I do tracking people, we discovered by accident, it really was a surprise to us, that one of the most interesting audiences to look at were college students who just graduated. And the reason they are interesting is because that's when, just as they graduate and get their first apartments, they have to decide which things they grew up with they were now willing to pay for. And that's where we saw 15 years ago they weren't getting landline telephones. And it was pretty obvious what was going to happen to the landline phone, and it has. That's where we saw 12 years ago they weren't getting the printed newspaper delivered to their door. That's where we saw 4 years ago they weren't getting cable and satellite television. And it's where we've seen in the last year they weren't getting television sets at all. But this is not lack of interest in television. Their interest in television is greater than any generation we've ever seen. They just want to watch their television when they want, where they want, and importantly, they don't want to spend $85 a month for cable or satellite to watch television. The cable companies are in a bit of a quandary because they're now looking at every year for the next 10 to 20 years, a minimum of 10% rate increases to pay for the cost of programming. And they now know, and the average cable bill right now without premium channels is $85, and as it crosses $100, a threshold's going to be reached, and they now know that every time they raise their rates, there's going to be cord cutting. That's one of the reasons why Time Warner Cable went to war a year and a half ago with CBS, took CBS off of Time Warner, but unfortunately it was a silly war. Time Warner Cable, we knew before the war started, and we certainly learned after it ended, had no leverage. What were they going to do? Tell their customers they couldn't get CBS? And everybody knew that war was going to end. It started in the summer, no later than the beginning of September because of football. When CBS went to war with Time Warner, it was getting about 60 cents per month per subscriber. What it wanted and got at the end of a 5-year contract was about $2 a month, and that will kick in about 4 years. And that's what the war was about. Now, I've been talking for the last 4 years about the whole world of television changes, or is at the tipping point again, when HBO goes over the top. The only horn tooting I will do, and then we'll get past that, is when it finally happened in October, the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times led with, "You've been saying this longer than anybody," but I didn't think I was brilliant to think that. HBO had to go over the top. It really annoyed them last year when Netflix surpassed them in the number of subscribers. HBO is still far more profitable, and HBO was looking at its future tied to cable, which was shrinking, but not at an alarming rate. It was shrinking slowly, and looked at Netflix, whose future was tied to broadband, which was expanding. The thing that drove HBO over the top last October, it probably wouldn't have happened for another year or so, was Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch trying to buy Time Warner. Jeff Bewkes had to scramble, promised and fighting off Rupert's offer that they would double the profits at Time Warner. Time Warner's down to 3 divisions. Warner Brothers, a great division, but didn't have a very good year last year. Turner, another great division, which also didn't have a very good year, and HBO. So it's out of HBO. They have to get the money to deliver the profits to keep suitors away, and they're doing that by going over the top. Now, HBO went over the top in the Nordic countries 3 years ago because they didn't have legacy relationships with cable companies. They had to worry about offending. And HBO and Netflix have been well aware, especially HBO with its wonderful app, HBO Go. HBO has been well aware that many people who don't pay for cable are sharing user IDs and passwords. We estimate that for every legitimate user and ID and password, there are 4 people illegitimately sharing. And this doesn't bother HBO. They're like crack dealers handing out free samples and getting people hooked. They want the people who don't have cable to be watching, and when they offer an over-the-top service, which will start in the spring with the premiere of the new season of Game of Thrones, then they will begin cracking down on the people using user ID and passwords, although they will probably create a household rate where you'll pay an extra couple dollars more and your children at college, or actually anybody you want to share it with, can use it. Now, the HBO announced in October it was going over the top. Within 24 hours, CBS announced it would go over the top. And incredible kudos to Leslie Moonves and Jim Lanzone for taking CBS over the top. Clearly, they were ready. They were just waiting for HBO to pull the trigger. But sadly, it hasn't worked out the way it should have, in my view. In my hopeful view, up until October, of how this would happen, HBO, for anyone who gets it through a cable company, you spend $15 a month for HBO. Of that 15, $7.50 goes to the cable company, $7.50 goes to HBO. I think, all by myself in my own work, I think HBO should have gone over the top at $12. At $12, they make an extra $4.50 per month per subscriber. The consumer saves $3, and everybody's a winner. Sadly, HBO has not announced their pricing yet. I was in a meeting with them, and I said, "You're not going over at 12, and they nodded their head. They wouldn't tell me the number. We believe it's going to be somewhere between $18 and $20. More than they pay for it through cable, even though there's no cable company to take a cut of it. And then CBS, as much as they deserve credit for going over the top, I think has made a colossal mistake in going over the top at $6. $6 for a channel you can still get free if you put an antenna on your roof, and a channel that doesn't contain, for $6, the most valuable programming on CBS, the NFL, because they don't have the streaming rights. So the way I think people are just going to reject $6 a month for CBS. But the way it should have worked was HBO at 12, CBS, if they now Leslie Moonves would laugh at me appropriately, he's right. But if CBS really wanted to be gutsy, really wanted to be bold, they would have gone over the top for free. They would have gone back to who they always were, a free ad-supporting network. As I said, Moonves would laugh because soon he's going to get $2 a month times 100 million subscribers, and he'd say, "You're an idiot if you think we ought to give $200 million a month away." Fair enough. They should have gone over the top at $2, and with HBO at 12 and CBS at 2, the package you could have put together was Netflix at 9, HBO at 12, you're at 21. Then you added the 4 networks at $2 each at 8, you're at 29. And then you add another 4 or 5 channels you want, like what Sling TV has done, for $10 or $15, and all of a sudden at $40, you have a pretty good package. And people don't want a lot of channels. 1975, when most markets had 7 television stations, 90% of viewing was on 3, ABC, CBS, and NBC. 30 years later, when most markets had over 100 channels, 90% of viewing was on 6 to 9. You give people infinite choice, they only want a little bit. Restaurant owners know this. Restaurant owners know that people hate Cheesecake Factory menus. They drive you crazy. You spend all your time, you have too many choices to make, you feel like you haven't seen most of it. What people want in a restaurant is 8 to 10 choices. enough choices to feel you actually have a choice, but not to be overwhelmed. And on the internet, where technically you have tens of millions of choices, but let's be practical and say thousands, on the internet, 90% of internet time is spent in 15 places. My 15 may be different than yours. If you have a tablet, you may have 8 or 9 screens, as I do, of apps, but 90% of my time is spent on screen 1 or screen 2. So people could have bought a package for $40, told their cable company to take a hike, and life would have been good. Instead, we're looking at Netflix at 9, let's say HBO at 18, although it could end up at 20, so you're at 27, and the other 3 networks are going to be compelled to match CBS at 6 each, so that's 24. All of a sudden, you're at $51, and then when you add another 4 or 5 channels, you're at 60, 65, and all of a sudden, what the cable companies always promised you, that if we go to a la carte, you're going to end up spending as much and getting less, is beginning to happen. Which means the cable companies, who really had a lot to fear from over the top, and the satellite companies, now have been given a reprieve. Now, and we've seen this with Foxtel in Australia, and I think we'll start to see this in the US, now they can go back and create $30, $35 packages, and all of a sudden people don't really care at the end of the day whether it's over the top, cable or satellite, broadcast, Pony Express, or whatever. They've been given an opportunity to fight. But over the top, with networks at 2, HBO at 12, could have really changed the game.